right. Well, Leslie, thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate you taking the time, and yeah, thank you. Welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure, Blaine. I really am happy to be here.
So before we kind of jump into our deep conversation today, we have a little segment called the Freedom Minute, and this is just some rapid fire questions to kind of get us into the conversation today and get to you know our listeners a little bit more about you and just kind of give a little bit of insight into your life. So the first question is,
Okay.
it is called the Freedom First Podcast, and we're about freedom for whether it's financial freedom or just freedom for all people with whatever direction that is. So what does freedom mean to you?
Wow. Freedom means to me that as a woman, I have the rights equal to any man anywhere. And it really is about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution for me. That I have the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness however I see fit.
Well, I love that answer. Yeah, and going back to the forefathers and the Constitution, and then even the struggles throughout, whether it's civil rights or the women's suffrage or whatever that is. I really love that answer, and I think gets right to the point. So thank you. Second question. Obviously, kind of listening to your story, seeing the different struggles you went through, and then the perseverance. Um, what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given or ever received?
The best piece of advice I have ever absorbed is that when you admit that you are powerless over many things in your life, you can find a tremendous amount of power and freedom. And part of admitting that you're powerless is also saying that you need help, that none of us are in this life or this world alone, and that it is incredibly empowering to turn to other wiser people to help you.
What's your favorite or best book you've ever read? And I know you're an author, so and a, and
As
a
a
reader.
writer, it's very hard to narrow it down. And I'd say that right now, my favorite author is Joan Didion, who recently died. And my favorite piece of her writing is an essay that she wrote for Vogue magazine a long time ago called On Self Respect. And it really is about looking in the mirror and facing exactly who you are and taking life on life's terms and understanding that there are very few things that any of us are entitled to in this world, and that there is so much strength in facing reality.
Well, that's incredible. Yeah, no, I always say, and the reason I ask this question, I ask it quite often is, I always say, leaders are readers, right? And whether you're an author, whether you're in business, like to be successful and get that edge, you have to be, relentless in reading and be a voracious reader. So thank you for that. Um, you've had a lot of proud moments, just kind of reading your story. So what's the most proud moment in your life thus far?
I have three wonderful children, and I'd say every time I see them do anything, it's the most proud that I've ever been. There's a saying about motherhood that motherhood, when done right, is building a temple that you're never going to live in. And that's what I feel like. I'm very proud of the temple that I've built in my children and for my children. They are independent thinkers, they're very strong people and very grounded. And I'm really proud of all three of them.
Well, that's incredible, and with having a mother like you, I'm sure they there's so much thought and advice they get from you. So I'm sure they're gonna be successful in whatever they do. So that's amazing to hear. Last question: if you could sit down and have a conversation with anyone throughout history, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
I think the person that I would most like to sit down with and have a conversation with is Mary Magdalene, Jesus's wife, consort, partner, because I think that we don't know that much about her, and she
Right.
obviously was a incredibly influential person in history. And I would like to know from her what really happened back then, what Jesus was really like, and also what she thinks of how women have been subjugated since that time, and how many of Jesus's teachings have been really thwarted and abused by the very people who say that they follow him the most stringently.
Yeah, I mean that's insightful answer, and I'm a teacher of history, so going through history, women are left out a lot, right? In the history books.
Exactly.
Until recently, we've started to, you know, derive, kind of change curriculum and talk more about the women, because I mean there's so much history, and I think you bringing up that answer there, it shows a lot, right? We don't know a lot about her, in the history books or in scripture or whatever it is. So I think that's a great answer. And we see the amazing women like yourself, and we go back to whether it's the Amelia Earharts or Rosa Parks, and we start seeing so many stories, and they continue coming, right? Women we didn't know about. So it's so inspiring to see that, and I think for future women leaders, to be able to look at those people and kind of derive leadership or inspiration from them is incredible. So thank you for that.
It's true. There are a lot of hidden female heroes in every culture's history.
Yeah, and they keep coming out, right? We keep seeing, we keep kind of seeing these different stories that were hidden, that we didn't know about, and whether they make them in the movies or books. So it's amazing to kind of keep pulling and keep kind of pulling those different layers out and seeing these different women throughout history, different centuries and different eras. So, and we're gonna keep finding more. So, I love to hear it, love to see it. So, Leslie, you've obviously, those of you that don't, or the people that don't know your story, we're gonna kind of get into that in a little bit. But I want to kind of start off with your childhood. Kind of where did you grow up? What was your childhood like? Where did it all start for you?
I grew up in Washington, D.C. My father was a lawyer and my mother was a teacher, a special education teacher. And they were both extremely well educated. They had met at Harvard and Radcliffe colleges in the late 1950s. And my family was very education focused, really into competition and athleticism, and kind of a wonderfully chaotic family. My mother was not into housekeeping, and she was a wonderful cook and a wonderful mom, but she didn't suffer fools lightly. And my father wasn't around a lot. He'd grown up extremely poor, and he was very focused on his career and on providing security for us, because that's what he had not had as a kid. So my mom really ruled just about everything. And she had some great traditions and rules. One was that we could have any pet that we ever wanted. So we grew up with snakes and skunks and turtles and parakeets and horses and cats and dogs. And it was delightful in that way. She also really loved New England and New Hampshire in particular, and she took us there every summer. And we had these amazing barefoot summers, where we just were allowed to explore nature. And then we would return to Washington, D.C. for the school year and be exposed to politics and diplomacy and international neighbors and friends. And it was a really incredible way to grow up. There, of course, were dark sides. As I said, my father was a very aloof figure who I loved very much, but who I really didn't know at all. And that's a real loss in my life. And I'm glad that fatherhood in particular, is changing in a lot of ways, and fathers are much more involved now. And then my mother had a history of alcoholism in her family, and she was an alcoholic as well. And so my life changed every day, around 5 o'clock, when my mother started drinking. And although she was the most important person in my life and the source of emotional stability and sustenance, she also was one of the most vicious people I've ever known when she was drunk. And it was a trauma for me and for everybody in our family.
So, I mean, you're kind of obviously the different dynamic, and there's a lot of people that are listening to this kind of dealing with the same thing, or have kind of seen the same things. Going through, living in DC, going through that thing, you're seeing a lot of different things going on. What was your what was your aspirations as a kid and young adult? Obviously, we see you, end up going to Harvard, getting a BA in English and stuff. Was that something you were always interested in? Kind of the creative and writing aspect?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was I still am exactly who I was as a little girl. I was a rule follower, sort of like a very like kind of like a innocent goody two shoes. I sat in the front row of every classroom I've ever been in. I was always the teacher's assistant everywhere I went. I was the neighborhood dog walker and babysitter, like the kid you would turn to for anything that needed to get done. And I was very shy and quiet as well. I loved boys. I loved boys so much. I still love boys. Um, and I grew up, growing up in Washington, D.C. was really quite extraordinary because money didn't matter. Financial success didn't matter. What mattered in all the lives of the adults who I knew, including my parents, was what you did with your brain and your gifts. And my neighbors included Neil Sheehan, who was a New York Times reporter who broke the Pentagon Papers and then wrote Bright Shining Lie, The Truth About Vietnam. Charlie Fanavesi, who was another reporter who was a Jewish hostage when the B'nai B'rith building was taken over in Washington. I babysat for Jimmy Carter's chief of staff's
Oh,
kids.
wow.
I had this really unbelievable exposure to politics and writing, and it shaped me, and it made me think that that I wanted to do something like that in my life.
Yes. So, obviously, we see you go to Harvard, and you get a BA in English. What was that kind of dynamic going to Harvard? Was that kind of was that a dream of yours to go to Harvard? Was that a dream school?
No, it was my parents' dream, and I had been raised to think that that's what I had to do, and I
Right.
heard them, and so I worked very hard to go there. And until I set foot on Harvard's campus as a freshman, it was my parents' dream. But as soon as I got there, it became my dream because I realized what a gift it was that they had given me by pressuring me and shaping me and guiding me to set my sights so high. And the most important thing about going to Harvard for me is that as a woman, I have never had to prove my intelligence to anybody since the day that I was accepted by Harvard College. And that is quite a gift, and it's saved me a lot of time and energy. And my experience as an undergraduate was very unusual because at the time I was confronting my own inner demons and I was giving up my own addiction problems that I had inherited in my family. And so I had a very introspective college experience. Unlike so many people who go to college and kind of let loose, I was the opposite. And I spent a lot of time alone. I worked very intensively with Harvard's English department to develop my writing skills. Every semester, I had a one-on-one tutorial with a writer who was part of Harvard's faculty. And it was really quite an amazing odyssey. And by the time I graduated, I felt like I had my feet really firmly on the ground. It was almost like going to Harvard for me was a rebirth
Mhm.
and a recentering of myself and who I wanted to be as a young woman starting out.
So you kind of mentioned you spent a lot of time alone. Were you an introverted person, like, to begin with, or how did that kind of work? Or did it become, you said you kind of had some demons there, or did it kind of evolve into that?
I would say that I'm a very social introvert. I really like people, and I have so many incredibly close friends in my life. But since my entire life, I've preferred being alone, and most of my childhood was spent wandering the parks of Washington D.C. with the neighbors' dogs, essentially alone. And so it was easy for me to be an introvert in college. But I did funny things, like I would go to the movies alone on Saturday nights, and right late into the night. It was glorious in its own way, but it was a very introverted existence, and I'm still a lot like that. And I love people, and I have them in my life in very strong ways, but I'm a classic introvert.
I mean, and the reason I asked that question is because I relate so much to that. I mean, I love people. I'm around people. I'm obviously in education and, around a couple hundred people every day. But on my own time, I love to be alone reading or writing I think a lot of people are kind of fearful of, going to the movies by themselves or doing these things by themselves. But a lot of people are just like that. They're introverted. And I kind of have experienced that kind of same dynamic as well. So that's kind of why I asked that question.
It's also, I think, Blaine, that it's true that once you are comfortable being alone and enjoying your own company, you discover that there's a whole nother world out there and that there's so much freedom that comes from accepting that it's okay to go to the movies or a restaurant or another country or any place alone. And I happen to really enjoy my own company, and I think it's a great source of inner strength to be okay being alone. And also, ironically, what happens is you meet a lot more people when you go out into the world alone. You meet a very diverse range of people. Traveling alone, going anywhere alone, as long as you're open to seeing that they're these wonderful human beings everywhere you go.
Right. I listen to different or read or watch different, like whether it's travelers or travel vloggers. And one of the things they say is you have to travel alone. Like in your life, travel alone one time in your life. And it'll open up a whole different experience, a whole different, kind of different side of travel and different side of sociology and people. So I'm interested in, I haven't done it yet. So maybe it'll come. So
It's a great metaphor for life too, to travel alone.
yeah,
It doesn't mean that you're a loner
right.
or a hermit. It's just that you're really solid on your own 2 feet, and you can go out and face the world that way.
Right. So what happened? So let's talk about, so you graduate from Harvard, and what kind of came after that? Where did you go from there?
Ugh. So life ended up throwing me a real curveball. I graduated from Harvard. I had an amazing job that I'd worked really hard to get. I was a writer and editor at 17 magazine in New York City. And I felt like, I have this great degree. I've stared down some of my addiction demons. I'm going to take on the world. And I hadn't dated much in college. So part for me of living in New York City was just seeing this incredible plethora of amazing young men. And I dated a lot. I had a roommate who was an actress, and she was very much the same way. We were very open-minded, and we'd go out to lunch with one man and dinner with another and have a great time. And it was all very innocent and idyllic in so many ways. And the curveball that life threw me is that I fell in love with one of those men. And he was an extraordinary person, perhaps the smartest man I've ever met in my life. And he, too, had just graduated from an Ivy League school. He was working on Wall Street. He was handsome and charming and funny, and he adored me. And I discovered as I was falling in love with him that he had a really dark secret, which is that he had been viciously abused as a child by his stepfather. Broken his nose, broken his collarbone, broken his ribs, broken his arm. Connor was in the hospital several times a year, starting from the time that he was 4 years old. And he had also seen his mother beaten in front of him on a regular basis, which is perhaps the worst thing that you can do to a child. And I didn't realize that this was really above my pay grade. And I fell in love with him, and I respected and admired him because of what he'd been through. And I married him and left New York City and left my job at 17 to be his wife. And he started abusing me just a few days before we married. And again, it wasn't minor physical abuse. He strangled me. He pushed me downstairs. He held loaded guns to my head. And really, overnight, my life went from being incredibly promising to being a complete nightmare. And nothing in my life had prepared me for dealing with this. And like so many domestic violence victims, I was isolated and afraid and living a really warped existence where I thought that my purpose in life was to heal him and to help him instead of to protect myself. And it took me a very long time to get out of that relationship and to get out safely. And I didn't know it at the time, but that experience ended up being the narrative for my book, Crazy Love, which I wrote many years later, and a TED Talk that I did on the same subject of why domestic violence victims don't leave. And it really, that experience hardened me like clay in a kiln to being an advocate for women and abuse victims everywhere. And men are abused too. It's not just women, but most of the victims of that kind of violence are women.
Yeah, I mean, and there's always that question, right? Like, why didn't she leave, right? And that's, I always, when I hear that question, and I've heard this, other people say the same thing. It's kind of goes back to the victim, like victim blaming almost. And it's such a different dynamic that for those, for those that have not experienced it, um, it's hard to understand, right? So let's go into that real quick. So like what, obviously, you were in this relationship and you kind of talked about it, the abuse had happened, days before you got married. You know, how did it all kind of start? Did you see signs? And obviously you kind of talked about your abuser's background, as a child, as a kid seeing this and being abused himself. Is that a common thing, where the abuser was abused, early on in childhood and they had witnessed it or been abused themselves?
Yes, I've met thousands and thousands of domestic violence victims um, since publishing Crazy Love and doing my TED Talk. And the abusers, 100% of them, were abused as children. Childhood trauma is something that really embeds itself in you, and it's very hard to escape it without a lot of courage. And most people who are abused as children do not grow up to be abusers. They have someone who helps them or some kind of resilience that makes them, totally commit that they will never do that to somebody else. And my abuser seemed to be that way. He knew abuse was wrong. He hated what his stepfather had done to him. But there was this rage embedded deep inside him that he had never faced. And by loving him and by trying to be so close to him, I triggered that rage. And I don't think there was anything he could do about it. I don't think he wanted to be hurting me. I don't think he wanted to be pushing me away. I think he loved me and wanted help. But he was so damaged inside that he couldn't accept the love and help that I wanted to give. It scared him too much. And it wasn't until I realized that I couldn't help him that I was trapped by my love for him and my socialization, that a strong, smart, independent woman, which is the way I saw myself, that our highest calling was to help the damaged men in our lives. And to realize as a young woman that wasn't what I was supposed to be doing, that the best thing I could do for him was to leave him and to clearly communicate to him that violence against women is wrong and that it's criminal. That ended up, when I left him, that's why I did it, is that I wanted to save myself, but I also knew it was the best thing for him if I left him. And I left him 4 years in. It was a very long 4 years, and I was about to turn 27, and my life started over again when I left him.
Right. And I mean, you kind of see this different dynamic, and what was the turning point, you think? I mean, you kind of talked about it, like you wanted, like you felt you wanted to help him, right? You wanted to change or like help get him help. Was that something you thought you could do at the time, and was a reason you kind of stuck around? Or
Well, there were many reasons why I stuck around, but the most compelling reason was that I felt that I loved him and that he deserved my love and he deserved help. And also he
sure,
reminded me tremendously of my own father, who had grown up in a very impoverished, abusive home too. So there was that generational layering on top of it. And it wasn't as if there was one, that I got into the relationship very slowly and fell in. I mean, it happened quickly, but my love for him and the vice of abuse happens gradually. They don't hit you on the first date,
right,
and the way that you get out is that way too. It was a slow awakening. But there was one final beating when we were in business school together where it became clear that he was going to kill me. And, Blaine, that does something to you. It was a beating that lasted for hours. I was on my own bedroom floor being strangled repeatedly into unconsciousness and being kicked and punched and having furniture broken over my head by my own husband. My beloved was trying to kill me. Now that does something to you. And it doesn't really matter if it's your boyfriend or your husband or your wife or your parent or even your child who's trying to kill you. When somebody tries to kill you, it changes you. And that changed me forever. And it gave me the strength to leave him and to start protecting myself, which I should have been doing all along. But our culture does not teach women to protect themselves, and that we have a right to protect ourselves. But that experience taught me that invaluable lesson.
Yeah, and I mean, you kind of talked about, and obviously you've owned your story, and I think that's hard for a lot of people to own their story eventually, and it took you a long time. It takes most people a long time, and some people unfortunately never get to own and tell their story. Um, so what eventually, like what I'm kind of looking at your story. It may took you a while to tell other people, right? What eventually made you kind of come out and tell that story? I think you talked about some of those events that were traumatic towards you. What was that final straw? What made you say, I'm gonna own this story? I'm gonna own it. I'm gonna tell other people.
It's a great question, Blaine. And I want to say to anybody listening that if you have not come public with your story of abuse or assault or whatever it is that your biggest secret is, please don't feel badly about it, because it's so hard to break the silence. And it's a very risky thing to do. And it is not for everybody. And for the first 5 years, I couldn't talk about it, really could not talk about it. And then I started gradually, clumsily being able to tell people what had happened to me. And then I got angry. And anger can be such a wonderful motivator. I got so angry at all of the people who said, why doesn't she just leave? Nobody ever says, why did he beat her?
Right.
You know? And why is that? And so I got very angry. And I thought, you know what? I'm a writer. I've always been a writer. Let me try to use words to explain this to people. And so I spent 10 years writing Crazy Love. And my singular goal with Crazy Love was for anybody who read it, they would feel what I felt. The love that I felt for Connor, the intense desire to help him, the thrill of being in love with such a magical person. And then what it was like to have that turn into a nightmare, and how difficult it really was to leave, and how dangerous. And so that's was my motivation for Crazy Love. And it took so long, and it took a lot of courage to do it. And I'm so happy I did it, because the first week that it was published, it was a New York Times bestseller. And I almost immediately huge groups of people, thousands and thousands in the audience started saying, we want to hear this story. And I never thought that's what my life was going to be. But I'm uniquely suited to breaking the silence, because I'm not a private person, because I didn't have children with Connor, because I don't have cultural ties that pressure me to stay quiet. And so many religions and cultures pressure victims, women in particular, but all victims, to stay quiet about abuse. And so I felt almost like called to do this. And I'm very happy with that curveball that life threw me, and what I've been able to do with it as an advocate to break the silence about abuse around the world.
So obviously, so we all know women, we all know not just women, but men and all kinds of different people and different family dynamics that include, domestic violence, domestic abuse. Do women, I mean, from your experience, do women feel ashamed to kind of to come out with their story? Obviously there's religious aspects to it as well. And sometimes it's scary, right? What is that dynamic like for a lot of women? Because a lot of women don't, they hold it in, and like we kind of mentioned before, so unfortunately things get so far. Sometimes we see that some women never get to tell their story. So why do they not tell it? Why do they hold it in for so long?
So I think it's much more complicated than shame.
Mm-hmm.
That might be kind of how it presents itself, but the vast majority of family violence victims are women and children. We live in a patriarchy, and women and children are, by definition, subservient to men. And part of that dynamic is that we want to very much protect the men in our lives because they give us a lot of stability in many ways, whether you're a wife or a girlfriend or a partner or a child. And additionally, the dynamic of family violence is always love comes first. There's love is the foundation, and then the violence is layered on that. So you're in this bind where you love the person who's abusing you, whether it's your father, your mother, or your partner, or even sometimes your child, because elder abuse by adult children, is a very common thing too. And so it's not that you're ashamed of being a victim. It's really very much that you want to protect the person who's abusing you. And that blame is a very complicated dynamic. To have love, which is one of the most powerful forces on earth, and fear, which is another really powerful force, to have them mixed on a daily basis, it's a very incredibly hard thing to overcome. And then if you throw in denial, that you're trying to deny that the person that you love is hurting you, then you have such an intense psychological, financial, physical, geographic cocktail that it's really like a miracle that anybody leaves a violent relationship and anybody is able to speak about it ever.
Were you in denial ever in your situation?
The whole time.
The whole time.
If you had come and knocked on my front door the morning after one of those, hundreds of nights that Connor had held a loaded gun to my head, and you had said, "Are you a battered wife?" I would have looked you full in the face and said, no. I went to Harvard. I grew up in a good family. I am a strong, smart, independent woman. I'm in love with this man and he's really troubled, but I'm not a victim. I would have said that to you. And even if I knew somewhere in me that I was a victim, I would have lied. If you had been a police officer, I would have lied to you to protect my husband. Because that's how strongly warped a domestic violence victim's mind becomes. And it wasn't that I had a weak mind or a weak character. It's just that it happens gradually, and in its own way, it's a very seductive trap. And so denial is a really compelling part of just about any abuse victim's story. You want to pretend that you're not being abused because it's that horrific. And as a result, the first person you have to tell the truth to is yourself. It might be that you never can break the silence and tell somebody else about it. But what I would say is the most empowering thing you can do is to admit to yourself if you are being abused by someone who you love.
And for you, how long did it kind of take for you to come to realization? And when did you come to realization? Reading your story and listening to your story is much later, right? Even after you had kind of ended the relationship and moved on.
It's hard to say exactly when my denial was broken because it was sort of like it kept getting pierced and then it would build up again. The first time he hit me 5 days before our wedding, he actually didn't hit me. He strangled me, which is much worse. My denial shattered then, but then I thought he would never do it again. I had 2 friends who confronted me about it, and that helped break my denial. When that final night when he tried to kill me, that broke my denial. But it wasn't really until long after the relationship had ended that I fully came to accept that I had been in an abusive relationship, and that it was very important that I never allow myself to be abused again.
Just looking at statistics, and one of the reasons why I think a lot of people maybe don't leave or are scared to, 70% of murders or 70% of whatever happens it happens after a relationship has ended, right? Is that a correct statistic?
Yes, and it's such a chilling statistic,
Yeah.
and that alone should explain to people why
Right.
we're so reluctant to leave. So the statistic is that 70% of domestic violence homicides happen after we've ended the relationship. And the first week after you end the relationship is the riskiest because you've triggered the abuser's rage by leaving them. You've triggered their fear, and they have nothing to lose by killing you at that point. So you have to be very careful about how you leave. And my relationship was very much like that. My ex had a complete breakdown. after I ended the relationship, and he stalked me for a long time. And I was careful. I knew enough to be very, very careful. And I had enough loving people in my life who I broke the silence and told them all what had happened. And they very strongly advised me to change my locks and to be very careful wherever I went and to always be surrounded by people who could protect me. And I did all that, but it's hard to do. And this is a simple thing, but I say this to every victim I know. Once you've ended the relationship, you can never be alone with the abuser again. Ever. They can't come to your house to get their stuff. They can't see you one more time. You have to be very careful to protect yourself and your children if you have them, because it's such a risky time. And it's amazing, Blaine, that we're even talking about that we live in a country where men are allowed to kill women who reject them, who leave them, even if those women have very good reason. We live in a country that says on some fundamental level that is men's birthright, to kill a woman who has left them. I mean, it's incredible. We're talking about the United States of America.
Right.
And it is really, you start looking at the headlines and you will see that it's completely accepted that men are allowed to do whatever they want to women in our country.
Yeah, it's appalling. I mean, and you look at these statistics and, over 500, 16 to 24-year-olds are 3 times as likely to be victims of domestic violence. So at younger age, over 500 men and women between 16 and 24 are killed every year in the United States. And that might be higher. That might have changed now. I think that was, I kind of got those statistics listening to you, back a few years ago.
And it's a vastly underreported crime.
Yeah.
Violence against women. Sexual assault and domestic violence are extremely underreported.
Right.
So those numbers, as chilling as they are probably the tip of the iceberg. And for many years now, I've been on the board of a wonderful nonprofit called the One Love Foundation. And they specifically try to reach out to 16 to 24-year-old men and women to educate them about healthy versus unhealthy love. Because that's really what we're talking about here. We don't teach how to love in our culture, or really any culture. We kind of assume that you're born knowing how to do it. And we're not. Maybe we're born knowing how to love, but we don't know how to build healthy friendships and relationships. And One Love has a really simple educational tools that anybody can access to teach them. And I'm a 56-year-old woman now, and I've been married twice, and I've been in a lot of relationships. And I still turn to One Love's 10 signs of healthy and unhealthy relationships almost every day of my life. So there's a lot to be done, but the good news is that there are so many people attacking this problem and trying to teach healthy love and trying to get abuse victims and the abusers the help that we all need to go forward with having healthier relationships in our lives.
What are some of those 10 things that One Love teaches?
Okay, so some of the 10 signs of unhealthy relationships are possessiveness, volatility, guilting, belittling, all the horrible dark underbelly of an intimate relationship. Mm-hmm. And some of the signs of healthy love are independence, comfortable pace, ability to resolve conflicts. These are the building blocks. And I think once you look at them, they're so obvious. But when you're in the throes of that rush of love for somebody, and it could be a romantic partner, but Blaine, it could just as easily be that rush of love that you feel for your mother or your father or some kind of caregiver. Love is really potent and powerful by biological design. And it's a wonderful thing, but it also can blind us. So that's why I think it's important to have the 10 signs of healthy and unhealthy love, or any kind of tool that you have that reminds you of what we're all after here. I don't think there's anybody who wants to be in an unhealthy relationship, right, truly. And I certainly don't. And it's taken, my entire life to learn these lessons. And I think I'm not done yet. I'm still on this path of learning what it really means to love myself and to love other people.
As we've kind of heard a little bit about your story and kind of what you went through, and we continue looking at these crazy statistics. Over 15 million children are abused every year in the United States. 1 in 3 American women experience abuse or stalking at some point in their life. You know, what what does domestic violence entail? Because obviously, I think the big narrative is it's men or a husband beating wife, but it's so much more than that, right? We have men.
It's true. It's true. I think that that's a very good point, because I think you have to add into this emotional abuse. And what abuse really is fundamentally is somebody who uses your vulnerability and your love for them to try to dominate and control you. And you can do that without ever laying a finger on somebody. And this is where the statistics start to change, and where men are victims just as much as women. Men are victims of emotional abuse, every day. Um, so that's what it is. So it could be something as blatant as what my ex-husband did, which is that, he would hold a loaded gun to my head. But it can also be possessiveness in saying that, that I have the right to look at your phone. I have the right to have an app on your phone that tells me where you are, whether you're my child or my partner or anybody. We don't have the right to do that as people. We talked at the beginning about freedom, and this is all about freedom, and abuse and freedom are completely incompatible. So if you are feeling in any way that somebody in your life is trying to control you or limit your freedom, you're simple things like where you can go out to dinner, what kind of music you can listen to, how you dress, when you're allowed to leave your house, how you raise your children, when you have children, all of that kind of power and control is abuse.
And you talk a lot in your talks and in your book and different works that you've done. You talk a lot about the stages of violence and domestic violence. It starts at stage 1. So what are those stages, and how does it progress along?
Abuse is so predictable that it's really like it's a disease with really clearly defined symptoms and stages. Just like, in cancer, you have like stage 1, stage 2, stage 4 cancer.
Right.
Abuse is the same way. The first stage is always a fairy tale. It's magic. You feel like you've met the person of your dreams. You fit together so beautifully. You're so comfortable with them. There is nobody on earth who has ever made me feel as seen and validated as Connor did. He saw exactly who I was as a young woman. It was intoxicating. So that's what the fairy tale stage is like. The next stage is always isolation, because you've got to isolate somebody physically, geographically, psychologically, financially in order to abuse them. And the most important thing to do is to get them away from their friends and family. And there are a lot of really subtle ways to do that, and not so subtle ways. So isolation is next, and then the threat of violence is introduced. So somebody might say something like, if I weren't such a gentleman, I would slap you right now for what you just said. Or they might hit a wall because they're so angry, or kick a dog. And what they're saying really is, if you don't leave now, you're next. And then the actual violence happens. And then the cycle repeats. Fairy tale, isolation. They start skipping the threat of violence because they don't need to do that anymore. So it's fairy tale, abuse, fairy tale, abuse, fairy tale, abuse. And throughout it all, there's a really strong pressure to not tell anybody. Because if you tell somebody, it's going to break it all. That's why breaking the silence is so important. But one of the reasons that you're pressured not to tell somebody is because of the love. You know that the person will get in trouble if you break the silence and tell somebody, whether it's your mother, your father, your lover, your boss, whomever. If you break the silence, they're going to get in trouble. And that's a hard thing to do as a victim, is to hold the other person accountable for what they're doing to you. And it sounds like it should be the easiest thing, Blaine, to ask for help and to protect yourself. But for a lot of people in our culture, we are taught to put other people in front of us.
Right.
And so that's the vice that you get trapped in an abusive relationship.
You talk a lot about like abuse thrives in silence, right? Abuse thrives in silence, and we talked about the reasons why, and we talked about the reasons why it's so hard to break that silence. But it's so true, right? If someone doesn't say something, or if a friend doesn't say something, it continues. So what are your thoughts about, and what would you tell others about that, the silence and abuse thriving in silence?
It is the single most important thing you can do to help yourself and also to help your abuser, is to tell somebody about it, to break the silence. And as long as the person who you tell is trustworthy and kind, it doesn't matter who you tell or how you tell them. It could be a colleague at work. It could be your best friend from childhood. You can send me an email, and this happens to me every single day. People break the silence by telling me. That's the most important thing to do, because then you break the denial and you break the control that abuse has on you. And it takes so much courage. And it's a very, very hard step to take, but it's the most important thing to do. And I would urge anybody listening right now to this wonderful conversation to think about who you can tell. And as I said earlier, the most important person to tell is yourself. And that's a huge step as well. But it's really important to be your own friend and to tell yourself the truth about what is happening to you. And I want to promise you that there is no shame in being a victim. And there's also no shame in being an abuser. You're not going to get your abuser in trouble. You're going to get them help. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And if you shine a light on what's happening, everybody is going to do better. But that's a very hard reality to face. But that kind of reality is your friend, and it's important to embrace it.
Yeah, I love how you mentioned that, you're getting help to the abuser as well, right? Because if you do that, you're kind of, you're helping someone else helping someone else to not be abused in the future, but you're also helping them to not hopefully abuse someone else in the future as well. So you're doing a huge service to
That's
society,
a great point,
right?
Wayne. Right. You're breaking the pattern, you're breaking the cycle, and you're preventing other people from having to go through what you have been through. And that is very compelling.
And perhaps their children, right? Going forward, if you could break that
Exactly.
silence, you could break, and I think, this is coming to fruition right now, and in my head, like, you could break a whole cycle of abuse that's happened in families, by just kind of saying something and helping the abuser and not getting them in trouble. So I think that's kind of changing that stigma and that narrative there.
It's really powerful what we're saying right now, because what we're saying is that words have the power to save lives. And anybody who's listening right now, you are breaking the silence just by listening to this. And what I would say to everybody is, try today to tell at least one person what you listen to on this podcast. And by doing that, you're taking such an incredibly powerful step, just by talking about it.
You talk a lot about overcoming adversity, and obviously you've overcome adversity. So briefly, let's talk about you kind of broke this silence. You kind of reported what happened, and you were able to move on and move forward in your life. What was that dynamic going forward and kind of getting past? And I don't want to say get past it, because it's always with you, right? But kind of learn from it and overcome that adversity. I know you do a lot of speaking and work on overcoming adversity. So what was this dynamic like, and what would you tell someone about overcoming adversity with whether it's domestic violence or maybe another topic?
Well, leaving an abusive relationship, for me, first and foremost, was an incredible rush of freedom. Freedom and relief. It really, in so many ways, was akin to getting out of jail. A prison of my own and my husband's making. And it was hard. I had to relearn a lot of things. I had to relearn how to be an independent woman, how to be on my own. I had to really face what I wanted to do in life. I got a graduate degree. I invested a lot in my education and my own economic freedom. I had the courage to marry again, somebody who was not abusive, and to have children with him, and to just rebuild my life. And the hardest thing I've ever done in my life is leaving my first husband. And everything since then has been a lot easier. And I've gotten so much help. The thing also that is important to note about breaking the silence is that is the way that you connect with other survivors, and also you connect with your community for help. So I got a lot of help from friends and family and strangers who helped me. They all helped me rebuild my life, and they were all very, very generous. Um, the paradox of our society is that although we are very invested in blaming victims, we also really want to help them. And people came out of the woodwork to help me so that I was able to move on. But they couldn't have helped me without me telling them the truth about what had happened to me. So telling the truth is a very powerful step that you can take.
Kind of what are some what or can people do to kind of watch for the signs? What can and should people do that maybe might not know or might know someone that's a victim? They might be a victim themselves. What are some signs and things that people kind of should watch out for?
Well, we live in a wonderful world now where there's so much information available. And I would say that the two easiest, most straightforward things to do would be to join the One Love Foundation and access all of their educational material. There's a lot of material there. The One Love Foundation is based in Bronxville, New York. It was founded in honor of Yardley Love, who was a domestic violence victim at age 19 at the University of Virginia. And come there, and then also come to my website, which is lesliebooks.com. I have a lot of information there, and you can also send me an email and I can I can give you more resources. But you can also just Google, abusive relationships, warning signs, red flags. There's so much information out there. And just by educating yourself, you'll start to see all of your relationships in a different light.
Right.
And you'll start to see the things that you do that might be abusive. And you'll start to see yourself the way that other people treat you in a more clear way. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. And education about abuse naturally leads to healthier relationships. And it's a very empowering thing to do.
Someone that's listening to this podcast right now, maybe they're a victim going through domestic violence right now, listening to the podcast, or maybe they know somebody, right, that a friend or a family member that is experiencing domestic abuse or domestic violence. What would you say to them?
That you're not alone, that this is much more common than anybody realizes it, and that it happens to children and men too, not just women. I would tell them to go watch my TED Talk because that's a really easy and sort of painless way to educate yourself and to just learn whatever you can about abuse, and to know that you're not alone, you have nothing to be ashamed of, and that there's so much hope. Most abuse victims get out safely and never repeat the pattern. And so if you can have the strength to leave, there's a very bright future waiting for you.
Obviously, you've done a lot of work. Talk about the work you're doing right now. Where can people follow you both professionally and see your work? And what are some projects you're kind of working on right now?
Okay. So my website is lesliebooks.com. And that's also where you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. On Facebook, I'm just Leslie Morgan Steiner. And I communicate, and that's the same for LinkedIn. I communicate a lot via social media and email. And I have only my one email address, and everybody is free to contact me. I continue to be a truth teller. It's really all I'm interested in. And I continue to be very focused on the experience of being a woman in America today. I think it's a fascinating time to be female. It's a vexing and frustrating time, but also exhilarating. And that's what my work is focused on.
I guess that's a topic I'll bring up then. What does it mean to be a woman today in America? What is this dynamic? What do you? Because I know you speak on this topic a lot, and we could probably have a whole podcast on this, or we for sure could.
It's true. I know. Let me try to come up with a last thing to say because we're running out of time here. I feel so lucky to be born female, to be a woman, to have had and raised children and to have loved so many people so abundantly is a great gift. But being female also means being subject to an unbelievable amount of pressure, harassment. To just be a woman who says, my body is my own body and I get to do what I want with it is a huge victory in our culture and every culture. So being female is a paradox. That's all I can say, really. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. I hope that being a man is half as interesting as this is. Um, but it's quite a journey to be female and to really embrace it. And I count myself as both lucky and unlucky in this way, but mostly lucky.
Oh yeah, I mean the women in the world are the strongest people, right? The mothers, and whether mothers or sisters or wives, right? They do so much, and it's speaking my own mom or whoever it is, right? They do so much. They're so strong. Whether it's
I know moms are the
oh yeah,
best. I know there's nothing like it. Being a mom and having a mom. And it doesn't matter how you get your kids, whether one of my books is about infertility and surrogacy. But that motherhood instinct is really, it's pretty
oh
rich,
yeah.
very powerful.
Oh, I appreciate my mom so much and all the women in my life, and the women out there listening. I know like we appreciate you so much, and continue striving forward, and we look to see you be leaders in the future. The young women listen to the podcast, and the last couple segments I have is you've had so much success, in your writing career, doing everything else that you do with advocating and speaking. What would you tell the not just the young women, but anyone listening to the podcast, whether they want to go into business or go into the corporate world or be a writer and author, or maybe they're trying to overcome something, abuse or whatever that is, in order to have success and reach their full potential, what would you tell them?
There are three things. One is dream big, invest in yourself, and ask other people for help. It's a great formula, no matter what situation you're in.
Wow. I love that. Simple, to the point, and people could take that right into their own lives. We have a segment we always do on the Freedom First podcast. This is called the Freedom Fighter of the Week. And this is someone that's been influential in your life and helping you get to where you're at today. Leslie, who's your Freedom Fighter of the Week?
It has to be my mom. My mom has been dead for quite a while, but she is the most important person in my life. And she, even to this day, she's with me, just cheering me on. And I love her so much, and I'm just so lucky to be her daughter.
Thank you so much for your time. I would love to have you come on again and there's so many other topics, work-life balance, and I have all sorts of other topics.
That would be great, Blaine. Let's
in
do
the future,
it. Let's do a whole nother one just on work-life balance, parenthood. There's so many really rich, amazing topics that we can cover, and I look forward to that. And I appreciate your time too.
Yeah, we'll have to do it again. I love this conversation. I think the impact that it's going to hopefully have on others, and that's why I did it. The Freedom First podcast, that the freedom to for women and to maybe escape an ugly situation that someone's in. And I just appreciate your time and appreciate everything you're doing, everything you're working towards, and just taking the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you.